And our first speaker, in alignment with what we had, we know that how society is important. She is SALLA FRANZÉN. She is the chief data scientist of SEB Sweden, and she is a prominent member of the community, of the scientific and research community in Sweden when it comes to AI. So SALLA, I welcome you to the conference, and please give your talk.
So I'm the group chief data scientist at SEB. SEB is a Nordic bank. We've been around for 150 years, and we do a lot of different kinds of banking. And we've been working for the last maybe 4 years on implementing AI systems across the bank. So I have an organization, a small team that works with different parts of the bank, identifying places where we can add value and creating different kinds of AI systems for them. But this is more about sort of AI in general organizations. So I'll have some examples from finance, but mainly sort of focusing on really AI in society and the impacts that we will have as organizations as we start using AI systems. So in general, you can sort of split it into, I guess, 2 sorts of AI, where one is trying to improve society. So things like healthcare, accessibility, safer workplaces come to mind there. Or you could use it as an oppressive force. And I think one of the things that really pushed my team and myself to start considering the ethical implications was that everybody kind of, there was a time and space where when people were talking about ethical AI, they would talk about killer robots and the singularity. And that's, of course, something that you need to keep in mind. But there is a lot of things that you can do from a societal viewpoint to really sort of try to implement safe and secure AI systems that adhere to the sort of cultural context that you are working in. As I said, AI for me is kind of focused slightly on AI in financial services, and I just wanted to show you the kind of focus areas that we have at SEB. And for me, I think it's a really exciting time to have this position to be the group chief data scientist, because it really allows me to try to support the organization in using different kinds of data and building different kinds of machine learning solutions in order to be able to enable the future. So 2 areas that we've been focusing on quite a lot. One is the anti-money laundering and knowing your customer. So this is kind of keeping the bank safe. We have a lot of AI systems that we're working on currently, and we're really trying to sort of consider the ethical values as we implement those systems. So it's not just about the sort of ML ops and the data pipelines and the machine learning pipelines. It's also being sure that we're adhering to the values that we believe are important and that our customers believe are important. The other one that's sort of a fun one is trying to create sort of proactive and tailored advice in a financial services industry. This is sort of has always been the core. In the 1860s, when SEB was founded, it was very much knowing your customer because it was your friend or someone that you'd been working with, and talking about sort of their business and trying to figure out how the financial services could support that client. But today, it's more and more the case that all of our clients are more and more digital, especially in this pandemic time. And that means that we have the opportunity to really understand our customers' behavior through the data and to give them better advice based on that behavioral data and also sort of transactional data. But in both of these cases, there's a lot of ethical risks and a lot of ethical considerations that we need to take into account. So if I mention some, for the Know Your Customer, a lot of customers feel that it's quite invasive, the extent to which financial services bank needs to ask questions today. So how can we sort of manage to create a sense of trust so that the clients understand why we're kind of pushing them to give us more information, and also being able to give something back, maybe being able to give them some analysis or better understanding on who they are as a customer. And when it comes to proactive tailored advice, of course, there's all this a lot of questions about integrity, how and what data we use. So I'm going to try to be quite concrete and talk about specific ethical values that I think are important in an organization in general. So in the European Union, I think especially, there's been a lot of talk about responsible AI. So responsible AI is kind of when you take 3 things into consideration at least. So one is the lawfulness. Of course, you need to obey the laws and take into account the fundamental rights that we have as humans. Of course, it needs to be robust and not open to malicious use or spoofing or some sort of cyber criminals to attack. But probably the most important one, if we're going to succeed in not ending up in another AI winter, is seeing to it that our AI systems adhere to the ethical principles and the ethical values that we have in our cultures. And of course, we need to see to it that it benefits individuals and society, and in particular, taking attention to people that are vulnerable in different ways. So ethical principles are quite interesting to think about. I know that there are many organizations already that have sort of ethical philosophical communities where you meet and discuss different cases, sort of what is the most ethical way of handling a specific situation. And one of the most interesting things for me, I'm a mathematician, so I like things to be sort of closed solutions, is that you can never sort of adhere to all ethical principles at the same time. So just to mention some examples, if you think about surveillance cameras, this is used very pervasively in some societies. So in the UK, for instance, they've had surveillance cameras surveying the citizens for many, many years. Whereas I think in Sweden, at least, when they tried to do the same, the citizens really got very upset with this. And so you have to be very clear that you have a surveillance camera somewhere, and there has to be a specific reason for why you want to have a surveillance camera installed. So it's kind of of course, they make it safer because you can go back and see what actually happened. But at the same time, you open up the sort of possibility to start tracking humans, which, depending on which society you are in, the ethical principles will have different levels of importance. Another one that I wanted to mention that, of course, is very sort of topical and has been for quite some time is hate speech on social media. So you may know that the former president of the United States was shut off from Twitter. He was banned from Twitter because they said that he had sort of gone over the limits where he was actually creating harm from a Twitter corporate perspective. So that was very interesting to see that their ethical principles actually came to play and had an impact that made them take a decision based on their ethical values. So the trade-offs tend to depend on the context that they're in, the culture, the values, and a lot of prior experience on how things tend to sort of pan out, I guess. And I think this is one of my probably favorite things. I'm a little bit of a rebel at heart. And I think one of the things that I really sort of admire about us as humans in society is that a new trend is doing makeup to sort of avoid facial recognition algorithms. So if you go to YouTube and you Google how to avoid facial recognition, you'll see a lot of really funky makeup styles. And this is one from Vogue, which is one of the sort of big fashion magazines. So I really like that we're kind of trying as humans also to react to different AI systems when we feel that they're sort of starting to get too close to where our ethical boundaries lie. And in some cases when they're far beyond them. So how about artificial intelligence in organizations? So I have an example from finance. It's not about my bank or the bank where I work. It's about credit limit setting. So when you apply for a corporate credit, when you apply for a credit card in general, the company will set a limit for you. And that limits will be based on a lot of different factors. So historically, it was kind of based on the knowing of the customer and sort of having a feeling about how much money they would be able to have as a credit and be still able to pay back on it. So there's a card. This is a case from the US. It's an example from Twitter. Somebody tweeted that he and his wife have been married for a very long time and they have a joint economy. Yet the man got 20 times the credit limit that his wife did. And that's fine. But the problem here is that when he started appealing and started to complain about the fact that this algorithm doesn't seem to be very ethical, it seems like there's some sort of bias in it, they just got told that it was the algorithm and that nobody understands it and that there's no way to fix it. And this is very much not in line with the principles, ethical principles of the high level, the recommended ethical principles of the high level expert group in AI in the European Union. So what they talk about is always having the human in the loop and always having someone that's responsible. So these are topics that I'll talk a little bit more about in a while. And one of the sort of things that really made this explode was that Steve Wozniak, who was one of the founders of Apple, had the same happen to him. 10 times the difference in credit limit and no way to get it corrected. Well, I guess Steve Wozniak probably got it corrected, and this at DHH also managed to get it corrected after a while. But it really took a lot of citizen attention to correct this. So as I said, lawful, ethical, and robust. So, I mean, in this case, it's definitely not ethical. It's actually quite interesting to study the lawfulness of the algorithm that they talk about in this case, because there's been some analysis about sort of gender balance as well. So if you take the female population and the male population and you actually separate them and you train two different models on the female population and the male population, and then you use them for the different humans, it will be more, it will be fairer. So women will get higher credit limits. But according to a lot of discrimination laws, you're actually not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to treat people differently in the beginning, but then apparently the machine can treat you differently. So I think from a law perspective, this is a really interesting question. I would say it's definitely not ethical. I would say that I'm worried about the robustness, considering that nobody can actually explain how that system works. So I'm going to focus on a couple aspects of ethical AI. This is a super interesting area, so I'm going to try to not talk too fast, but really give you some sense and flavor on different topics that you need to take into consideration in order to be able to say that, in order to feel secure that you're at least considering the ethical aspects of implementing an AI system. So these are the 5 topics that I'll try to cover. And the first one is explainability. So quite often when you're building an AI system in an organization, very much depending on what you're going to use it for, you need to find the right balance between explainability and accuracy. So if I take an example from an area that I know well, when it comes to credit scoring, at least we currently have actually decided to have a human-first approach in many parts of the credit scoring process, because we really believe that the explainability is the most important. And were we to roll out a true AI system for this, explainability would need to be like the highest priority, and then the accuracy we would have to accept would be potentially lower. When it comes to cancer detection, you probably want the accuracy to be the highest possible, and maybe you don't care as much about the actual explainability. So if you have a model that's 99.9% accurate, but you're not really sure about what it's doing, and you keep a human in the loop, so you still have a doctor that's kind of assessing the sort of fringe cases. Oh, so there's some other one. Excuse me, there's someone else speaking. Okay, good, thanks. Yeah, so when it comes to credit scoring, probably explainability is the highest, cancer detection, probably accuracy, and then the self-driving cars are kind of an interesting mix, because you probably want to have accuracy so that you can actually be sure that the car is not going to drive into a human. But you might not, but you would probably also care a lot about explainability because you want to be sure that you know what the self-driving car is doing. So explainability is a really interesting thing, and it's very important to take into account the sort of balance that you need when you're choosing the algorithm that you're going to use. Okay, and then another thing when it comes to explainability, another aspect of explainability is transparency. If a client comes and asks you, or if a stakeholder comes and asks you, how does this model actually work? You need to be sure that you can explain exactly what it's doing. And in order to be able to explain what it's doing, you need to be transparent. And these are kind of 4 things that are good to take into account in the design phase. So when you're starting to think about an area where you think that AI systems can be beneficial, these are typical questions that it's really good to at least have a discussion about before you start building your model. You might even decide, I mean, in the data question, you might decide that there are data sets that you don't want to use, either because you don't feel comfortable with the quality of the data, or you feel that this is sort of starting to come into integrity questions, and in the cultural context where you're working, it might not be appropriate to use that data. So, and it might be sort of different age groups might have different behaviors, but it's really important to always be sure that the data that's being used, that you're aware and transparent about the fact that you're using it. And then I think another one that I'm going to mention, so this will be available for you afterwards, so I'm not going to talk about them all, but this one I think is really interesting. When it comes to the stakeholders, so the end users of this AI system, is it voluntary to participate? So there are a lot of examples where it's truly voluntary. And then you have other examples where it's kind of voluntary, but the only way to not participate is to opt out. And opting out might mean that you're opting out from all the whole sort of system. So social media is typically an area where participation is voluntary. Yes, you can choose to be on social media or not be, but it's not necessarily voluntary to not share your data to specific users or specific purposes. So these are very good questions to keep in mind when you're building an AI system and trying to see to it that it's actually ethical. Another one that a lot of people talk about is bias. And I think this is probably the one that's the most talked about because it's kind of the easiest to start thinking about. So this is all about how you build your model. It's all about thinking about the target variable and whatever class labels you're going to use as your sort of target. You're going to use your target variable as your target variable. When you look at the training data, it can be really difficult to choose a good training data set in order to be sure that it's not biased. I think I have a favorite person on Earth. Her name is Joy Buolamwini. She is a researcher in the US, and she tried out different facial recognition algorithms. And when she tried them on her own face, in some cases it couldn't even recognize that she was a human. But when she cut out like a paper face with eyes and put it in front of her face, then the algorithm recognized that she was a human. So since she's a researcher, she started to investigate what the reasons were, and speaking to the researcher, the team that had created some of the facial recognition algorithms, it turned out that they trained on really biased data. So they forgot to include like how we look in the world and focused on whatever data was available. So now she spent quite some significant time with her research colleagues creating a better balanced training data set for facial recognition. So that's a really good example for that one. Feature selection and encoding is also really important, of course. I think as practitioners, we know this, but there's also very much an ethical aspect to it. Selecting features that don't sort of inherit biases. And then when it comes to proxies, it's quite easy to sort of think that you're kind of removing gender, for instance, or think that you're removing some of the other protected attributes that are in the fundamental rights of the EU. So these are data points that you're actually not allowed to use in very many cases. So the fundamental rights of the EU say that these attributes are protected. And that's really important to keep in mind because as many of you probably know, if you remove, for instance, the gender of a person, then you might still inherit some of that information from the other data that you're training on. And that, of course, can create a lot of unintentional bias. And then the last one that is typically talked about is sort of masking, where you're intentionally discriminating by sort of using these 4 previous main mechanisms to create really bad data in order to create a really bad model. Another aspect of ethical AI is fairness. So fairness can be defined in very many different ways. Very often they contradict each other. So you can kind of choose to focus either on the individual fairness, where you're looking at peer to sort of comparing peers, or you can look at group fairness. So when it comes to individual fairness, you could say that for me, an algorithm is fair as long as any protected attributes are not explicitly used in the decision-making process. If that's your definition, if you feel fine with that, then that's what your ethical value should be, and that's what you should be implementing in the monitoring of whether your model is doing what you're expecting it to do from an ethical perspective. Or you could say that similar individuals should have similar classification, and then you decide on a distance metric, which means similar for you, and then you check that the model is behaving as expected. Or you could say that an algorithm takes a fair decision if it's the same in both the actual world and the counterfactual world. So you're kind of changing individuals between demographic groups and looking at what the result is. And then when it comes to group fairness, this means that you're trying to treat sort of different groups equally. Could be, for instance, gender, could be different backgrounds, could be level of education, could be a little bit anything that you want to try out, whether your algorithm is adhering to the ethical values that you feel are important. So then we have the predicted outcome, where you're looking at the probability of every outcome and saying that it should be the same or similar for each group. Or you could sort of have a risk score, and then the proportion of people who are considered actually at risk should be the same across protected groups and other groups. Or you could say that, well, if the classifier gets it wrong, it should be equally wrong for all groups. And depending on which of these fairness definitions you choose, they're probably going to contradict each other. Or they might be sort of, one isn't necessary for the other, as in this case. The last one is kind of a combination of the two first ones. But this is also a really important thing to take into consideration. So here are some examples of fairness metrics that you could choose to use. Egalitarian social welfare, where you think that it's the fairest if the participant who has it the worst gets the best result. So if we take, for instance, as an example from my world, we could take mortgage pricing. Maybe it's the case that as a bank, we believe that we should give the lowest rates to the people that have the most struggling economy. And maybe we just decide to not care about risk weighting or anything. We just want to help those people. Then our value is that we want to have an egalitarian social welfare metric. That's what we see as fair. Or it could be a Pareto efficiency. So no one's outcome should be can be improved without making other people worse off. So then you just do that. That's your kind of optimizer on some level. Or you could see that, well, I want to guarantee that everyone feels that they get at least as good as what others get, which of course is super hard to achieve in reality. And I don't really know how you would construct that metric. But it's still really important to kind of decide on what kind of metric you want to use in order to be able to be sure that your model is kind of being monitored for fairness. Accountability and responsibility. These are things that people talk about a lot. I think when it comes to self-driving cars, it's always like this philosophical question, who should be responsible if the car is in an accident? Should it be the engineer? Should it be And it's a really important question. As you can see here on the right-hand side, roles of people, the responsibility should be split up. And we shouldn't sort of launch AI systems before those things have been decided. In organizations, I think we're quite used to having sort of splitting responsibility internally. But then when we start to talk to clients, this is going to be a really important area to kind of define, decide, and I guess regulate as well. There's a very interesting white paper from the EU from last spring, where they talk about this one. So it's very much inherited from sort of the AI ethical principles of Germany. But they say that if you have sort of an AI system in a product, then you should just sort of extend the regulations for that product to include kind of the AI system aspects. So that white paper I can really recommend. It's very sort of illuminating as well. So I think I've talked quite a lot about sort of values and ethical aspects. So what are values really? Well, the University of Edinburgh has this sort of design concept where they have 4 things that you need to take into account. So first of all, it's like identifying what values are important for the direct and indirect stakeholders, and what potential harms and benefits can the system cause, and how do they kind of, so how do the harms and benefits then map to the values? And then in the empirical value investigation phase, it's all about what the priorities are for the stakeholders for sort of various value components. So it could be kind of, we believe that it's the most important thing is to be fair from a social egalitarian perspective, sorry. And then that's kind of the first one that you would start to sort of check and monitor and see to it that you have sort of experts in the loop that can continuously see to it that it's sort of monitored and mitigated. Yes, and then the technical value discovery, of course, seeing to it that the technology design is streamlined in order to be aligned with whatever values come up in the value sensitive design phase. Thank you. So I want to end with 2 kind of highlights. Remember to look for simple and efficient explanations, because that's kind of what's going to make people understand AI. And transparency builds trust. And we want trust because we want to be able to work with AI for a long time to go. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salla. It was a very nice presentation, and I really appreciate the thoughts and the effort that is made in order to make AI more acceptable for our society. That's utmost important because technology has to be embraced. We have a couple of questions we have also seen in the chat. So Celia and Istvan has asked if the slides will be shared. So I think this is more a question to the organizers, and you are nodding, so I hope that means that yes, it will be shared. And the first question, you mentioned that there is a tension between accuracy and explainability of the AI. And we wonder from where it comes from. So Gergely asks what makes it, a tension between them.
Yeah. So, I mean, at least our experience in SEV working with sort of machine learning algorithms is that you can build like the coolest, best deep learning neural network that's 99% accurate, and then so we have an example is we have a predictive revenue growth model. So it predicts the revenue change for small and middle-sized companies in the next 12 months. And we built a super advanced model that we really sort of loved, and we were really proud of it. And then when we started sort of deploying it and trying to get the client executives to use it for advisory purposes, they came back and they said, I can't contact the client and say, hey, the model says that the machine says that you're going to have a really nice time in the next 12 months. So then we ended up having to go back and sort of restructure the model, choose very much more simple things so that the client executives could actually go back to the client and say, okay, so apparently like you have a lot of outgoing transactions that are sort of increasing, and like talk about the different features and the importance of the features in the model. So I think that's very much and it's not as accurate because it's like, it's a simple model.
Mm-hmm. I see. And now that I give some thoughts, I think when we think about AI as a neural network, for example, I think, at least myself, maybe it's my childish me who is expecting the magic happening within those millions of neurons, and then the explainability is coming at another level, because if I explain it very much, then I could have constructed it, right? So there's a little bit of questions around that. So thank you for the answer. Next question, who should validate if an AI is ethical? I think you have touched upon that one, but that's a question from András. And more exactly, if I read it, it's, just give me 1 second. Who should validate if the AI is ethical? And do you think AI systems will exceed the ethical norms of the corporations applying them?
Two good questions. I'll start with the simpler one. Who should validate the models? So I think, I don't have an answer, but I think the way that we're approaching it is to really connect with researchers in AI ethics. So there's an initiative in Sweden called WASP-HS, so Wallenberg AI Autonomous Systems and Software Program Humanities and Society, WASP-HS. And there we have really, really good contact with ethical AI researchers and having a discussion with them before deploying the model about kind of how we should be thinking about the values that we have as a bank, how we should be sort of taking that into consideration and really building it into the model. I think that's very beneficial. But I would probably guess that where we're going to end up is having sort of a committee. An ethics committee that's skilled enough to take decisions, potentially connecting with external people as well to be sure that we're not sort of blindsided by the way we work. So that's the answer to the kind of my answer to the first question. And then I think the second question, let's see if I can remember it.
I can repeat. So it's that, do you think that the AI, the ethics of the AI can overcome of the ethics of the companies they are I mean, that applying that AI?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, overcome in a bad way, absolutely. Sort of, it's easy to build a stupid model that does stupid things.
I think in a positive way.
Yeah, I think so too. So in a positive way, I think that would be awesome. I think it would be really cool. I mean, the thing with ethical values is it's so culture dependent. So, I mean, if you're a local company, it's probably easier because then you probably know kind of what the culture context is that you're working in. But if you're a global company, it becomes even more sort of difficult. I was speaking, this is a silly example, but I was speaking with a friend yesterday who said that she works in public relations, and she was trying to create a new branding color for a Finnish company. So I'm from Finland. And so she like Googled, is there any color that isn't sort of politically sensitive in the world? And there isn't. Every single color that you have in the RGB spectrum, there is some part of the world that's going to be really offended.
I see. Yeah, but these are very live examples, and actually at the end of the day, probably in the committee that you mentioned, there will be an AI deciding on the other AI being ethical, right? So
yeah. Meta AI.
Just a technical interruption. So probably you see a red dot at the stage, all of you who are listening to the presentation, and there's this pulse. So you can rate the presentation. So please go there, please give feedback, please be active. And then we go for the next questions. So the next question is, can AI be used to remove bias that the humans may introduce?
Yeah, that's kind of my hope. It really is. I think that as humans, I mean, it's this, yeah, this sounds pretentious, but it's this Daniel Kahneman thinking fast and slow thing that makes us inherently biased as humans. He has this wonderful example where, like, if you go on holiday and you come back, and I say it's a week, and I ask you, like, did you have a nice time during your holiday? Then you will give me the answer that is an average of the whole week and the last day. So even the sort of your experience of your holiday is going to be biased. Because that's how we work as humans. And I think as in the current states, it's quite often humans that are taking decisions. So that means that the training data that we're using is inherently biased. But this also gives us the opportunity to actually try to do something better, to try to sort of mitigate the bias that we as humans have. But it takes quite some hard work to figure that out.
So next from Zlatko, how mature is the field of XAI, and when can we expect 99% explainability with 99% accuracy? I don't know what XAI is. Maybe it's just a typo, I don't know. I don't know if you see it also in the chat box. So.
Yeah, usually it stands for Explainable AI.
Explainable, okay, that's my bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. I hope soon, but I think that as we mature into kind of the new AI landscape, hopefully we will really sort of focus the effort on the explainability, and maybe in some cases there are kind of better models that are waiting for us to find them that are easier to explain than kind of the most complex models that we have today. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I love being really involved in WASP, this Wallenberg AI and autonomous systems software program, because it really gives the opportunity to kind of connect with the researchers and try to understand the state of the art. Yeah, I think it is an area that we have to focus on if we're going to be using it in like a societal perspective. But I wouldn't give a year.
I see. Thank you. So one more question before the break, but before we are going to the break, I want to mention to you that SALLA will be available at 7 p.m. for a breakout session. So I see that there's ongoing chat in the chat box and a nice discussion. So yeah, I think that the 7 p.m. session is really there to discuss these kind of questions live in a chat room. Okay, so let's see one more example, one more question, and that question is coming from I was selecting it, but now I have to find it again. So coming from Zsolt. Zsolt asks that if the data has to be chosen very carefully before training the models, how do we ensure that there is no selection bias in the data when the model is trained? I think
yeah. Yeah. It's a really tricky one. Yeah, especially when you're sort of going from models in production. Then you can't sort of sit there and manually choose what you're doing. The only thing you can kind of do is have monitoring in place so that you can be sort of at least track how the model is progressing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is. I mean, it's exactly this sort of, is it fairer to treat people differently in the beginning or to allow the model to treat people differently? And that's why it's a fascinating area. So I'm in no way am I an expert, but I'm very, very interested. So I've read up a lot. But I think it is fascinating because this is kind of where AI kind of meets the human. Mm-hmm. And we need to figure out these things when we deploy, and it's going to be different depending on the purpose. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So thank you very much. I take the opportunity to ask one more question, and that's of my interest more. I'm also a mathematician. I think I share this passion with you. And I'm just interested, where are the AI algorithms today? Is there any bias introduced by the mathematics itself in the today's, or what is your knowledge in this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely not introduced by the mathematics. It might be introduced by the mathematician. Okay. I mean, I did like 10 years of math research because I love mathematics because it's completely objective and always true. I did theoretical mathematics, so yeah.
Same way I love it. Okay, thank you very much, SALLA.